On the morning of October 25, 1944, in the waters off Samar Island in the Philippines, a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers found themselves facing the most powerful surface action fleet the Imperial Japanese Navy could assemble. The odds were not just unfavorable, they were catastrophic. Massive battleships, including the legendary Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, bore down on a collection of thin-skinned escort carriers that were never meant to face surface combat. Between these carriers and certain annihilation stood a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, vessels so outgunned that their engagement seemed almost suicidal. Among these defenders was USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer under the command of Commander Ernest E. Evans, a Cherokee Native American who would prove to be one of the most aggressive and fearless commanders in naval history. What Johnston did that morning would become the stuff of legend, a story of courage so extraordinary that even enemy combatants would salute her as she went down. This is not merely a story about a ship, but about the 327 men who crewed her, about leadership in the face of impossible odds, and about a moment in history when courage and sacrifice changed the course of a battle that could have changed the course of a war. The Pacific War by October 1944 had turned decisively in favor of the United States. After years of brutal island-hopping campaigns, American forces had finally returned to the Philippines, fulfilling General Douglas MacArthur's famous promise. The invasion of Leyte Island had begun on October 20, 1944, and was proceeding according to plan. However, the Japanese High Command understood that losing the Philippines would effectively cut off their access to the oil and resources of Southeast Asia, the very reason they had started the war. They were willing to risk everything in one massive gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet. Japanese plan, called Shogo or Victory Operation, was complex and relied on deception. A northern force of aircraft carriers, now depleted of most of their aircraft, would lure Admiral William Bull, Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, away from the invasion beaches. Meanwhile, the main striking force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would transit the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the vulnerable invasion fleet. It was a desperate plan, but desperate times called for desperate measures. What the Japanese didn't anticipate was that a small group of escort carriers and their screens would be in their path, and that these tin cans would fight with a ferocity that would disrupt the entire operation. Commander Ernest E. Evans was 36 years old in 1944, a career naval officer who had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1931. Part Cherokee, Evans had faced discrimination but had proven himself through sheer competence and an aggressive spirit. When he took command of Johnston during her commissioning, he made his philosophy crystal clear to his crew. He told them that the ship's mission was to protect the larger vessels of the fleet, that they would take the fight to the enemy, and that any man who could not match his commitment should disembark immediately. Evans was not given to empty rhetoric. He meant every word, and his crew would soon discover that their commander would ask nothing of them that he wouldn't do himself. USS Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of the most successful warship designs in American naval history. These destroyers were 376 feet long, displaced about 2,500 tons, and could make speeds exceeding 35 knots. They were armed with 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, and an array of anti-aircraft weapons. Compared to the battleships and heavy cruisers of the Japanese fleet, Johnston was a lightweight. The Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons and mounted 9 18.1-inch guns. Each shell from these monsters weighed 3,200 pounds, more than an entire salvo from Johnston. The heavy cruisers Johnston would face displaced 3 to 4 times her tonnage and outranged her guns by thousands of yards. By every measure of naval combat, Johnston had no business engaging these ships. Yet the situation off Samar on that October morning would demand exactly that suicidal engagement. Taffy 3, The designation for Escort Carrier Group 7743 consisted of 6 escort carriers and 7 screening ships, 3 destroyers including Johnston, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. These escort carriers, nicknamed Jeep carriers or baby flat tops, were converted merchant hulls designed to provide air support for amphibious operations and convoy protection. They were slow, lightly armed, and had thin armor that couldn't stop a heavy shell. Their aircraft were loaded with anti-submarine weapons and light bombs, not the armor-piercing weapons needed to damage battleships. The stage was set for what would become one of the most dramatic naval battles in history. As the sun rose on October 25, the men of Taffy 3 expected another routine day of providing air support for the troops ashore. Instead, they would find themselves in a battle for survival against overwhelming odds. The actions of USS Johnston and her commander in the next few hours would exemplify everything that the naval service meant: duty, honor, courage, and sacrifice. The destroyer that fought like a battleship was about to earn her place in history, and Commander Evans was about to demonstrate that sometimes the size of the fight in the ship matters more than the size of the ship in the fight. USS Johnston's story begins in the shipyards of Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation in Seattle, Washington. Her keel was laid down on May 5, 1942, at a time when American shipyards were operating at maximum capacity to replace losses from the early months of the Pacific War and to build the fleet that would carry the war to Japan. The Fletcher-class destroyer program represented American industrial might and naval design excellence combined. These ships were larger and more capable than their predecessors, incorporating lessons learned from early combat while maintaining the speed and agility that made destroyers effective. The Fletcher-class design was revolutionary in many ways. Previous American destroyers had suffered from being undergunned and having insufficient range for Pacific operations. The Fletchers addressed these shortcomings with a powerful armament suite centered on 5 5-inch 38-caliber dual-purpose guns arranged in single mounts, with 3 forward and 2 aft. These guns could engage both surface and air targets effectively, firing a 55-pound shell to ranges exceeding 18,000 yards. The fire control systems, while not as sophisticated as those on battleships and cruisers, were still capable of accurate shooting under combat conditions. Johnston's torpedo armament was equally impressive. She carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts located amidships. The Mark 15 torpedo carried by American destroyers in 1944 had finally overcome the reliability problems that plagued earlier Marks. With a 600-pound warhead and the ability to run at 45 knots for over 6,000 yards, these torpedoes were deadly weapons against any surface target. A Fletcher-class destroyer could unleash a spread of 10 torpedoes that could cripple or sink even the largest warship if they found their mark. This would prove crucial in Johnston's future engagement. The ship's anti-aircraft armament reflected the increasing importance of air defense in the Pacific War. In addition to the dual-purpose main battery, Johnston carried multiple 40 Bofors guns and 20 Oerlikon cannons. As the war progressed and kamikaze attacks became more common, many Fletchers would have their anti-aircraft batteries increased even further. The ships also carried depth charges and depth charge projectors for anti-submarine warfare, making them truly multi-mission platforms. A Fletcher-class destroyer could hunt submarines, engage surface targets, defend against aircraft, and conduct shore bombardment, versatility that would prove invaluable throughout the war. Johnston slid down the ways on March 25, 1943, with Mrs. Ernest E. Evans serving as sponsor. The selection of the future commander's wife as sponsor was unusual but fitting. Construction proceeded rapidly, and Johnston was completed in a remarkable 6 months from launch. On October 27, 1943, USS Johnston was commissioned into the United States Navy with Commander Ernest E. Evans assuming command. The commissioning ceremony was relatively modest by the standards of later ships, reflecting the wartime urgency that pervaded every aspect of naval construction and operation. There was a war to win, and Johnston needed to join the fight. Commander Evans' address to his crew during commissioning has become legendary in naval history. Standing before his assembled crew, this stocky, determined officer made his expectations crystal clear. He told them that USS Johnston was going to be a fighting ship, that they would seek out the enemy and engage aggressively, and that their job was to protect the larger ships of the fleet no matter what the cost. Evans informed his crew that he would never retreat unless ordered to do so, and that he would never ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Then came the line that would define Johnston's spirit. Any man who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. Not a single sailor left the ship. They understood they were serving under a warrior commander, and they chose to follow him into whatever battles lay ahead. Evans' background shaped his command philosophy in profound ways. Born in Oklahoma, he was part Cherokee and grew up in a time when Native Americans faced significant discrimination. His appointment to the Naval Academy through a competitive process was an achievement in itself, and he had to work harder than most to prove himself. This background instilled in Evans a fierce determination and a refusal to back down from any challenge. His classmates and fellow officers noted his aggressive spirit and his absolute loyalty to his crew. Evans believed in leading from the front, and he expected his officers to do the same. This leadership style would permeate Johnston's culture and prepare the crew for the ultimate test they would face. Ship's motto, though unofficial, became, "Don't give up the ship," words spoken by Captain James Lawrence of USS Chesapeake during the War of 1812. For Johnston's crew, this wasn't just a historical reference but a command philosophy. Evans drilled his crew relentlessly, running combat exercises and damage control drills until every man could perform his duties blindfolded. He cross-trained personnel so that if casualties occurred, other crew members could step into essential roles. The ship's gunnery department practiced constantly, and the torpedo crews rehearsed their procedures until loading and firing became second nature. Evans understood that in the chaos of combat, ships that survived were ships whose crews had trained until their responses were automatic. Johnston's shakedown cruise and initial operations revealed a tight, well-trained crew and a ship that performed to expectations. The Fletcher class had proven to be an outstanding design, and Johnston exemplified the class's virtues. She was fast, maneuverable, and packed a powerful punch for her size. More importantly, she had a crew that believed in their ship and their commander. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison would later write that Johnston had a crew that would fight her to the last shell and the last man. This spirit was not accidental. It was cultivated deliberately by a commander who understood that morale and training were as important as guns and armor. By mid-1944, Johnston had completed her training and was ready for combat operations. She departed for the Pacific Theater, joining the vast armada of ships that were prosecuting the war against Japan. The crew was eager but also apprehensive. They had trained for combat, but training could never fully prepare men for the reality of battle. What they didn't know was that within months, they would be tested in ways that exceeded any training scenario, and that their ship would perform actions that would be studied by naval strategists for generations to come. USS Johnston's journey to her destiny began with her transit across the Pacific to join the forces gathering for the Philippines invasion. The voyage gave the crew time to adjust to the realities of the Pacific War, the vast distances, the tropical climate, and the sense that they were entering a theater where battles were won or lost based on training, luck, and courage. Commander Evans used the transit time to continue drilling his crew, running exercises, and preparing them mentally for combat. He wanted no illusions among his men. They were heading into harm's way, and their survival would depend on how well they performed when the shooting started. Johnston's initial combat operations included convoy escort duties, anti-submarine patrols, and shore bombardment missions. These operations, while not generating headlines, were essential to the overall war effort. Convoy escorts protected the supply lines that sustained American forces advancing across the Pacific. Anti-submarine patrols kept Japanese submarines from interdicting these supply lines. Shore bombardment softened enemy defenses before amphibious landings. Johnston performed these missions competently, but her crew sensed their commander was waiting for something more, a chance to take the fight directly to the enemy's surface fleet. That opportunity would come as part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The battle was actually a series of separate engagements spread over 3 days and covering over 100,000 square miles of ocean. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Americans successfully secured the Philippines, Japan would be cut off from its southern territories and the resources that kept its war machine running. If Japan could destroy the American invasion fleet, the war would be prolonged indefinitely, and the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands would be exponentially more costly. Both sides knew this battle could decide the war's outcome. The Japanese plan for the battle was complex and relied heavily on deception and coordination. Admiral Toyoda Somu, commander of the combined fleet, understood that Japan's carrier force was now a shadow of its former strength. The devastating losses at Midway and the Philippine Sea had destroyed much of Japan's naval air power. However, the Americans didn't know how weak the Japanese carrier force had become. Toyoda planned to use his carriers as bait to lure Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet north, away from the invasion beaches. With Halsey's powerful battleships and fleet carriers out of position, Vice Admiral Kurita's center force would transit San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the vulnerable invasion fleet off Leyte. Kurita's force was formidable, the largest concentration of Japanese naval power assembled since Midway. The force included the battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, mounting 18.1-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing over a ton to distances exceeding 25 miles. The force also included the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. In total firepower, Kurita's center force outgunned everything the Americans had in the immediate area by a significant margin. If this force reached the invasion beaches, the consequences would be catastrophic. Hundreds of transports and supply ships would be sitting ducks, and the troops ashore would be cut off from reinforcement and supply. The American dispositions reflected the fleet's dual missions of supporting the invasion and protecting against Japanese naval counterattacks. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, the most powerful naval force in the world, was providing distant cover with its fast battleships and fleet carriers. Closer to the invasion beaches, Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet provided direct support with older battleships, escort carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. The escort carrier groups, designated as Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, were positioned off Samar to provide air support and anti-submarine patrols. These baby flat tops were never intended to engage surface combatants. Their mission was to launch aircraft, not to fight gun duels with battleships. Taffy 3, the northernmost of the 3 escort carrier groups, was under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, a capable and experienced officer who specialized in carrier operations. His force consisted of 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay Flagship, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay. These ships were essentially modified merchant hulls with flight decks built on top. They displaced about 10,000 tons, could make 18 knots maximum speed, and were armed with a single 5-inch gun and light anti-aircraft weapons. Their armor was minimal, designed to resist splinters and near misses, not direct hits from heavy shells. Screening Taffy 3 were 7 ships, 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. These 7 ships represented all that stood between the escort carriers and annihilation if an enemy surface force appeared. Under normal circumstances, they would never be expected to face battleships and heavy cruisers. That was the job of the fleet's battleships and cruisers. But circumstances on the morning of October 25 would be anything but normal. The night of October 24-25 saw multiple developments that set the stage for the battle off Samar. American submarines and aircraft had detected and attacked Kurita's center force as it transited toward San Bernardino Strait. Aircraft from Halsey's carriers had sunk the super battleship Musashi in a massive airstrike that took hours and dozens of torpedo and bomb hits to bring down the giant. The attacks forced Kurita to temporarily reverse course, leading American commanders to believe he had abandoned the attempt to penetrate to the invasion beaches. This assessment would prove tragically wrong. Admiral Halsey, receiving reports that the Japanese carrier force had been located to the north, made the fateful decision to take his entire force north to engage what he saw as the primary threat. Halsey believed that the carrier force was the more dangerous enemy and that Kurita had been driven off. He also believed that the battleships and cruisers guarding San Bernardino Strait were sufficient to stop any Japanese force that might appear. In one of the war's great ironies, those battleships didn't exist. A communications failure meant that the force Halsey assumed was guarding the strait had actually accompanied him north. San Bernardino Strait was unguarded, and Taffy 3 was about to discover this in the worst possible way. As October 25 dawned, Johnston's crew went about their routine morning stations. Breakfast was being served, and the ship was at a reduced state of readiness consistent with operations in waters where the immediate threat was considered minimal. The escort carriers were launching their first missions of the day, anti-submarine patrols and ground support strikes. It was shaping up to be another routine day in the Pacific War. Then at 6:47 a.m., lookouts on the escort carriers spotted something on the horizon that sent chills through every man who saw it. The distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships were visible, and they were close, much too close. Taffy 3 was about to face its ultimate test, and USS Johnston was about to begin her journey into legend. The first reports from lookouts seemed almost impossible to believe. Japanese battleships and cruisers on the horizon, closing rapidly on Taffy 3's position. It couldn't be happening. Admiral Sprague's first reaction was disbelief, but within moments the identification was confirmed. Kurita's center force had transited San Bernardino Strait undetected during the night and was now bearing down on the escort carriers at flank speed. The pagoda masts visible on the horizon belonged to battleships that outweighed each escort carrier by more than 3-to-1 and mounted guns that could destroy them with single salvos. The nightmare scenario, surface ships attacking the escort carriers, was unfolding in real time. Admiral Sprague faced an impossible situation. His carriers were slow, thin-skinned, and helpless against heavy surface units. Running was an option, but the Japanese ships were faster and would overhaul the carriers within an hour. Fighting was absurd. 5-inch guns and torpedoes against battleship armor were like flies attacking elephants. Yet Sprague had no choice but to try everything possible. He ordered the carriers to turn east, away from the Japanese, and to make maximum speed. He ordered his screening ships to lay smoke to conceal the carriers. He ordered all available aircraft launched to attack the Japanese ships, and he radioed for help, though he knew no help could arrive in time. On Johnston's bridge, Commander Evans observed the Japanese fleet through his binoculars and made a decision that defined his character and his ship's destiny. Without waiting for orders, without coordinating with the other destroyers, Evans ordered Johnston to flank speed and turned directly toward the Japanese fleet. His executive officer looked at him in disbelief. They were charging battleships and heavy cruisers in a destroyer. Evans' response was simple and direct. "We're going in. This is what we were trained for. Any man who's afraid can leave his station." Not a single man left his post. Johnston accelerated to over 35 knots, her engine straining as she worked up to full speed. Black smoke poured from her stacks as the engineering crew pushed the plant to its limits. On the bridge, Evans was calm and focused, giving orders in a steady voice despite the enormity of what they were attempting. The gun crews loaded and trained out their weapons. The torpedo crews prepared their tubes. Throughout the ship, men braced themselves for what was coming, knowing that in minutes they would be under fire from guns that could vaporize their ship with a single hit. The tactical situation was starkly simple. The Japanese force consisted of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, overwhelming firepower arrayed against 6 escort carriers and 7 screening ships. The Japanese had every advantage: speed, firepower, armor, and numbers. The only advantages the Americans possessed were courage, training, and the desperation that comes from defending with your back against the wall. Commander Evans planned to use those advantages to maximum effect. Johnston's first target was the heavy cruiser Kumano, leading the Japanese formation's western column. Evans intended to close to torpedo range, launch his fish, and then retire under smoke. It was a standard destroyer attack, except that normally destroyers made such attacks at night or with multiple ships coordinating their approach. Evans was making a daylight solo attack against a formation that included some of the most powerful warships in the world. The mathematics of naval combat said this was suicide. Evans was betting that audacity and surprise would trump mathematics. As Johnston closed the range, Japanese guns began to fire. The first salvos fell short, raising enormous geysers of water as the shells impacted. The Japanese gunners were finding the range, and within minutes they would begin hitting. Evans ordered his ship into a series of radical maneuvers, zigzagging at high speed to spoil the Japanese fire control solution. Shells began landing close enough that spray drenched Johnston's decks. The ship shuddered from near misses as the shock waves from heavy shells, impacting nearby, transmitted through the water and into her hull. At approximately 7:10 a.m., at a range of 10,000 yards, Johnston's torpedo officer reported a firing solution on Kumano. Evans ordered the torpedoes launched. In rapid succession, all 10 of Johnston's Mark 15 torpedoes leaped from their tubes and entered the water, their wakes arrowing toward the Japanese heavy cruiser. The torpedo crews had performed flawlessly under fire, and now everything depended on the torpedoes running true and the Japanese not detecting them in time to evade. The torpedo run took approximately 3 minutes, an eternity for Johnston's crew as Japanese shells continued to bracket their ship. Evans reversed course after launching, seeking the cover of smoke that the other screening ships were laying. Then, observers saw something remarkable happen to Kumano. The Japanese cruiser suddenly shuddered as multiple torpedo hits struck her bow. Huge columns of water erupted alongside the cruiser as the 600-pound warheads detonated against her hull. Kumano's bow was blown off, and she immediately began losing speed and dropping out of formation. Johnston had drawn first blood, and a heavy cruiser, a ship 5 times her size, was crippled and out of the battle. The success came at a price. As Johnston turned away, Japanese shells began finding their mark. A 14-inch shell from a battleship struck aft, destroying one of the 5-inch gun mounts and killing or wounding most of the crew. Another shell struck the bridge, destroying communications equipment and wounding several officers, including Commander Evans. Shrapnel tore through Evans' left hand and left him bleeding heavily, but he refused to leave his post. More hits followed. Johnston's rudder was damaged, reducing her maneuverability. One of her boilers was destroyed, cutting her top speed. Fires broke out throughout the aft part of the ship. Yet Johnston continued to fight. Her surviving guns continued firing at Japanese ships. Her crew fought the fires and shored up damaged compartments. In the engine room, the engineering crew kept the remaining boilers running despite steam leaks and shell fragments that had penetrated the hull. On the bridge, Evans wrapped his wounded hand in a handkerchief and continued directing the ship's movements and fire. Johnston had been hurt, but she was far from finished. Commander Evans positioned Johnston between the Japanese fleet and the escort carriers, using smoke and Johnston's remaining speed to make herself a difficult target while engaging Japanese ships whenever they came into range. The other destroyers, Hull and Heermann, along with the destroyer escorts, were now also engaging, creating a confused melee that disrupted the Japanese attack. The destroyer attacks forced Japanese ships to maneuver to avoid torpedoes, breaking up their formation and disrupting their fire distribution. This was exactly what destroyer screens were supposed to do: sacrifice themselves if necessary to protect the high-value units they were screening. The aircraft from the escort carriers added to the chaos. Every available plane was in the air, attacking with whatever ordnance they carried. Pilots made dry runs, simulating attacks without weapons, just to force Japanese ships to maneuver. Torpedo bombers attacked with anti-submarine torpedoes never designed to penetrate battleship armor. Fighter pilots strafed battleship bridges with .50 caliber machine guns that couldn't even scratch the paint. It was magnificent and desperate courage on display. And it was having an effect. The Japanese force, which should have brushed aside this opposition in minutes, was being forced to fight for every yard of advance. Johnston continued her impossible fight, engaging targets of opportunity as they emerged from the smoke. At one point, she engaged a column of 4 cruisers, firing at ranges where her shells could actually penetrate their armor. Japanese return fire was intense. Shells from multiple ships were now targeting Johnston. The destroyer took more hits, losing additional systems and suffering more casualties. Her forecastle was a mass of wreckage. Fires burned out of control in several compartments. Her maximum speed was down to about 17 knots. Yet still she fought, her remaining guns firing, her crew refusing to give up. The tactical impact of Johnston's actions, combined with those of the other screening ships and the aircraft from the escort carriers, cannot be overstated. The Japanese force, which had possessed overwhelming superiority and a clear path to the vulnerable invasion fleet, had been disrupted, delayed, and forced to fight for every mile of advance. Ships had been damaged. Formations had been broken. Most importantly, time had been consumed. Time that allowed the escort carriers to escape. Time that allowed Admiral Kinkaid to organize a response. Time that ultimately convinced Admiral Kurita that he was facing a much stronger force than was actually present. The confusion of the battle worked in the Americans' favor. Japanese observers reported engaging cruisers and fleet carriers, not escort carriers and destroyers. The volume and accuracy of fire coming from the American ships convinced Japanese commanders they were facing first-line units, not the second-string forces actually present. The aggressive attacks by Johnston and the other destroyers seemed like something only fleet destroyers screening heavy units would attempt. The air attacks, though carried out with improvised weapons, were pressed home with such determination that Japanese observers assumed they were facing the aircraft from Fleet Carry. Everything contributed to the impression that Kurita had stumbled into Halsey's Third Fleet, not a minor task force of escort carriers. This misidentification had profound consequences. Admiral Kurita, already fatigued from days of sustained combat and concerned about air attacks, became increasingly convinced he was facing a major American force. His ships had taken damage from torpedo attacks. His formation was scattered. Radio communications were difficult due to battle damage and atmospheric conditions. When he received reports that American battleships were approaching from the south, reports that were incorrect, Kurita made the decision to break off the attack and withdraw. At 9:20 a.m., just as Johnston was fighting her final battle, Kurita ordered his ships to disengage and retire through San Bernardino Strait. The battle off Samar was over, and the invasion beaches were safe. The irony was bitter. At the moment Kurita ordered the withdrawal, his ships were on the verge of breaking through to the escort carriers. Gambier Bay had been sunk by shellfire, the only American carrier ever sunk by surface gunfire. Several other carriers were damaged. The screening force had been decimated, 3 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort sunk, the others damaged. The aircraft were running out of ammunition and fuel. Another hour of combat and the entire task force might have been destroyed. Yet Kurita withdrew, convinced he had accomplished what he could against superior forces. The sacrifice of Johnston and her sisters had created an illusion of strength where none existed, and that illusion had saved the day. For the men of Johnston in the water, the battle's end brought no immediate relief. They floated in groups, many wounded, all exhausted, surrounded by oil slicks and debris. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly. Sharks, attracted by blood and thrashing, began to circle. Some men succumbed to their wounds. Others, driven mad by thirst and exposure, swam away from the groups and were lost. The survivors maintained discipline, forming rafts from debris and supporting their wounded comrades. They sang songs to keep their spirits up. They took turns watching for rescue ships. They refused to give up, honoring the fighting spirit their commander had instilled in them. Rescue came in stages over the next 2 days. American destroyers and destroyer escorts, returning to the battle area once the Japanese had withdrawn, picked up survivors. The process was complicated by the vast area over which debris and survivors were scattered, by the need to maintain anti-submarine patrols, and by uncertainty about whether Japanese forces might return. Each ship that arrived was greeted with desperate hope by survivors who had been in the water for hours or days. The count was grim. Of Johnston's 327-man crew, only 141 survived. Commander Evans was not among them. Multiple survivors reported seeing him go down with the ship, refusing to save himself until all who could be saved had abandoned ship. The other ships of Taffy 3's screen had suffered similarly. USS Hull sank with heavy casualties. USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort that had fought with a gallantry equal to the destroyers, went down with significant losses. USS Heermann, heavily damaged, survived to fight another day. The escort carrier Gambier Bay had been sunk, and several other carriers had been damaged. Total American casualties for the battle off Samar exceeded 1,500 men killed or missing, a heavy price, but infinitesimal compared to what would have been lost if Kurita's force had reached the invasion beaches. The final hour of USS Johnston's life exemplified everything that naval service represents at its finest and most tragic. As the ship lay wallowing in the swells, her stern settling deeper and her bow rising, the crew faced the reality that their home and their ship was dying. Yet even in these final moments, discipline held. Officers and chiefs moved through the ship, checking compartments to ensure no wounded were left behind. The engineering crew secured the machinery spaces, preventing explosions that could kill men in the water. Gun crews removed firing pins from weapons to prevent them from discharging as the ship sank. Every action was deliberate and professional, even as enemy shells continued to fall around them. Commander Ernest E. Evans, his hand wrapped in bloody bandages and his body bearing multiple wounds, moved through his dying ship with calm determination. Survivors reported that he showed no panic, no despair, only a steady focus on getting his men off the ship safely. He personally supervised the evacuation of the wounded, ensuring that even the most severely injured had life jackets and were placed in rafts or helped over the side. When one sailor hesitated to jump into the oil-covered water, Evans put his good hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "Go on, son. We'll be all right. Get yourself to safety." That sailor survived. Commander Evans did not. The abandoned ship order came with Johnston still under fire from Japanese ships. Several accounts from survivors mention that some Japanese ships appeared to deliberately fire over Johnston rather than into her, an apparent gesture of respect for the destroyer's gallant fight. One survivor reported seeing what he believed was a Japanese officer on a passing destroyer standing at attention and saluting Johnston as she went down. Whether this actually occurred or was a hallucination born of exhaustion and stress remains uncertain, but the story has become part of Johnston's legend and speaks to the respect that warriors can have for each other even across enemy lines. As men went over the side, they faced immediate dangers beyond the obvious one of being in the water while a battle raged around them. The sea was covered with fuel oil that coated men's faces and burned their eyes. Debris from Johnston and other damaged ships posed collision hazards. The water, while warm by most standards, would still cause hypothermia after prolonged exposure. And beneath the surface, sharks had been drawn to the area by blood and vibrations. Survivors had to overcome their fear and exhaustion to swim away from the sinking ship. Staying too close meant being dragged down by the suction as the ship went under. Johnston's death throes were observed by many in the task force. The destroyer had fought so magnificently that even in her final moments, men on other ships stopped what they were doing to watch. As her stern settled deeper, her bow rose higher, pointing toward the sky at an increasingly steep angle. Her remaining flag, the stars and stripes, still flew from the mast. Then, with a sound described as a deep groan or sigh, Johnston slipped beneath the waves stern first. She disappeared at 10:10 a.m., leaving behind only an oil slick, debris, and men in the water. The destroyer that fought like a battleship was gone. The men in the water faced an ordeal that would last hours or days depending on when rescue reached them. They formed groups around life rafts and flotsam, knowing that staying together increased their chances of being spotted and rescued. Officers and chiefs maintained command structure even in the water, organizing the groups and making decisions about rationing the limited water and medical supplies available. Men took turns holding up wounded comrades who couldn't support themselves. They sang songs from basic training, recited prayers, and told stories about home to keep morale up and distract themselves from their desperate situation. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, Johnston's gunnery officer and senior surviving officer, organized the survivors and kept them focused on staying alive. Despite being wounded himself, Hagen moved between groups, encouraging men who were losing hope and organizing those who still had strength to help the wounded. His leadership in the water was as crucial as his leadership in combat. Without it, many more men might have given up and died from exposure or despair. Naval training emphasizes that officers are responsible for their men in all circumstances, and Hagen lived up to that responsibility in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The psychological impact of the experience was profound. Men who had just fought the most desperate battle of the war, who had seen their shipmates killed, who had watched their ship sink, now had to find the strength to survive in the water. Some succeeded through sheer stubbornness. They refused to let the Japanese win by dying. Others survived through faith. They prayed constantly and believed they would be saved. Still others survived through loyalty to their comrades. They kept going because giving up would mean abandoning the men around them. All of them survived because of training that prepared them for the unthinkable and leadership that gave them examples to follow. Rescue, when it came, was emotional beyond description. Survivors watched destroyers approach with a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that rescue had arrived, fear that it might be a Japanese ship come to finish them off. When American ships confirmed their identity and began pulling men from the water, grown men wept with relief. The rescue ship's crews treated the survivors with extraordinary compassion, giving up their own bunks, sharing their clothes, and providing whatever medical care was possible. The bond between sailors is strong in any circumstances, but the crews who rescued Johnston's survivors felt a special kinship with men who had fought so gallantly. Not all of Johnston's crew would make it to rescue. Some died of their wounds in the water. Others, driven delirious by sun exposure and thirst, swam away from groups and disappeared. A few were taken by sharks, though survivor accounts suggest this was less common than in some other naval disasters. The count of 141 survivors from 327 crew members represented a casualty rate of over 56%, devastating by any measure. These casualties weighed heavily on the survivors, who carried guilt about surviving when so many shipmates had died. This Survivors' guilt would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. Commander Evans' death affected his crew profoundly. Multiple survivors reported that they had seen him on the ship as she went down, that he had refused to leave while any of his men remained aboard. Some reported seeing him wave from the fantail as the ship went under. Others said he had gone below one last time and never emerged. The exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. What is certain is that he went down with his ship, fulfilling the oldest tradition of naval command. His body was never recovered. Ernest E. Evans rests with his ship in over 20,000 feet of water off Samar Island, his grave marked by the wreck of the destroyer he commanded with such courage. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw the survivors struggling to process what had happened. They had fought a battle that seemed impossible, had survived an ordeal that killed many of their shipmates, and had helped win a victory that saved thousands of other American lives. Yet they felt no triumphalism, only exhaustion and grief. As they were transferred to hospital ships and support vessels, they began the difficult process of recovering physically and emotionally from their experience. Many would carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. All would carry the memory of their ship and their fallen comrades. Section 7, Legacy and Discovery. The casualty count from USS Johnston was sobering, but represented only part of the human cost of the battle off Samar. Of Johnston's crew of 327 officers and men, 186 were killed in action or died subsequently from wounds or exposure in the water. Commander Ernest E. Evans was among those lost, along with many of the ship's officers and senior enlisted personnel. The survivors faced long recoveries from wounds, exposure, and trauma. Some would return to duty on other ships, others would be medically discharged due to their injuries. All would carry the memory of that October morning for the rest of their lives. The recognition of Johnston's extraordinary actions came swiftly from the Navy, but would take longer from the nation at large. On October 27, 1944, exactly 1 year after Johnston's commissioning, the Navy Department announced that Commander Ernest E. Evans would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions during the battle off Samar. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the USS Johnston, in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet during the battle off Samar on 25 October 1944. The citation continued, describing Evans' decision to attack without orders, his aggressive leadership throughout the battle, and his refusal to abandon his post despite severe wounds. It concluded, "The valiant fighting spirit of Commander Evans and his crew contributed decisively to the defeat of a major Japanese force off Samar in the battle for Leyte Gulf." The medal was presented to Evans' widow in a ceremony at the Navy Department. Evans became the first Native American in the Navy to receive the Medal of Honor, though this aspect of his heritage was not emphasized at the time. He was honored as an American naval officer who had done his duty with extraordinary courage. USS Johnston herself received the Presidential Unit Citation, the Navy's highest unit award. The citation recognized the entire crew's heroism and the ship's decisive contribution to the battle's outcome. This was entirely appropriate. While Commander Evans' leadership was crucial, Johnston's fight had been a team effort involving every man aboard. From the engineers who kept the ship running despite catastrophic damage, to the damage control parties who fought fires and flooding, to the gun crews who kept shooting until their weapons were destroyed, every member of Johnston's crew had contributed to the ship's legendary performance. The survivors of Johnston formed a close-knit association that would meet regularly for decades after the war. These reunions were both celebrations of survival and memorial services for the fallen. As the years passed and the survivors aged, the reunions became increasingly important as opportunities to share memories with the only people who truly understood what they had experienced. The last known survivor of USS Johnston, Robert Billy, passed away in 2019 at the age of 93, 75 years after the battle. With his death, there were no longer any living witnesses to Johnston's fight, though the story would continue to be told by historians and preserved in the memories of descendants. The impact of Johnston's actions on the battle off Samar and the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf cannot be overstated. By attacking aggressively and forcing the Japanese to react to her attacks, Johnston had helped create the confusion and delay that ultimately led Admiral Kurita to break off his attack. The damage Johnston inflicted on Kumano took that heavy cruiser out of the battle at a crucial moment. The Japanese destroyer attack that Johnston disrupted might have finished off the escort carriers if it had succeeded. Every minute Johnston bought with her sacrifice was a minute the escort carriers used to escape and launch more aircraft to attack the Japanese force. Naval historians and strategists have studied the battle off Samar intensely, recognizing it as one of the most extraordinary surface actions in naval history. The tactical lessons are numerous. The battle demonstrated that well-trained, aggressively led smaller ships could disrupt and delay much larger forces through sheer audacity. It showed that morale and fighting spirit could, in some circumstances, compensate for material disadvantages. It proved that destroyer torpedo attacks, long a staple of naval tactical doctrine, could still be effective against modern battleships and cruisers. And it reinforced the importance of screening forces, the ships that stand between the high-value units and the enemy. The strategic impact was equally significant. If Kurita's force had broken through to the invasion beaches and destroyed the hundreds of transports and supply ships present, the Leyte invasion would have been crippled. American forces ashore would have been cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The timetable for the liberation of the Philippines would have been disrupted by months at least. The psychological impact of such a defeat might have strengthened Japanese resolve to continue fighting. Instead, the Battle of Leyte Gulf became a decisive American victory that effectively destroyed the Japanese Navy as a fighting force. Taffy 3's desperate stand was a crucial component of that victory. For 75 years after the battle, USS Johnston lay undisturbed on the ocean floor. The depth at which she sank, over 20,000 feet, made her wreck inaccessible to all but the most sophisticated deep-ocean exploration equipment. As technology advanced, there was increasing interest in locating the wrecks from the battle off Samar, both for historical purposes and to honor the men who had died there. However, the extreme depth and the vast search area made this a challenging proposition. Multiple attempts to locate Johnston and other wrecks from the battle were unsuccessful. The breakthrough came in October 2019 when the research vessel Petrel, funded by the late Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, located what was believed to be Johnston's wreck. The initial identification was tentative due to the extreme depth and the condition of the wreck. Then, in March 2021, explorer Victor Vescovo led an expedition using the deep submersible limiting factor to visit and survey the wreck. What they found confirmed beyond doubt that this was USS Johnston, and the condition of the wreck told the story of her final battle. The wreck lies at a depth of approximately 21,180 feet, over 4 miles down, making it the deepest shipwreck ever located at that time. The extreme depth means the wreck is under pressure exceeding 9,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush standard diving equipment instantly. Only specially designed submersibles can reach such depths. Vescovo's expedition made multiple dives to the wreck, documenting its condition with high-definition video and still photography. What they found was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Johnston's hull is broken but largely intact, lying upright on the seabed. The damage from the battle is clearly visible, massive holes torn in the hull by Japanese shells, the destroyed bridge structure, the mangled remains of gun mounts. The ship's bow section shows the battle damage clearly, with armor and deck plating peeled back by exploding shells. Yet despite 75 years on the ocean floor and the catastrophic battle damage, Johnston's hull number, 557, is still clearly visible on the bow. The American flag painted on the hull near the bridge is still discernible, and most poignantly, the ship's bell, if it could be reached, would still bear her name. The discovery of Johnston's wreck generated significant media attention and renewed public interest in the battle off Samar. Descendants of crew members expressed mixed emotions: grief at seeing their father's or grandfather's grave, pride at seeing the ship that had fought so gallantly, relief at finally knowing where their loved ones rest. The Navy declared the wreck a protected war grave, prohibiting any disturbance of the site. This means Johnston will remain where she lies, a permanent memorial to the men who served aboard her. Victor Vescovo's expedition treated the wreck with extraordinary respect, mindful that they were visiting a war grave. No artifacts were recovered, no penetration of the hull was attempted. The submersible maintained a respectful distance while documenting the wreck. Before leaving the site, Vescovo placed a memorial plaque on the seabed near Johnston's hull, honoring Commander Evans and the crew. The expedition also conducted a brief memorial service, reading the names of those who were lost and offering prayers for their souls. It was a fitting tribute to men who had given their lives 76 years earlier. The technology that allowed Johnston's discovery represents a remarkable achievement in deep ocean exploration. The limiting factor is a two-person submersible capable of diving to full ocean depth, the deepest parts of any ocean on Earth. It uses titanium pressure spheres to protect the occupants from the crushing pressure and sophisticated sonar and imaging systems to navigate and document wrecks in the pitch-black conditions of the deep ocean. The ability to reach and document wrecks at such extreme depths opens new possibilities for underwater archaeology and allows us to honor veterans of battles long past by documenting their ships' final resting places. The story of USS Johnston continues to resonate with modern naval personnel. The destroyer is frequently cited in leadership courses as an example of aggressive, decisive leadership under impossible circumstances. Commander Evans' immediate decision to attack without orders is studied as an example of initiative and tactical judgment. Johnston's fight is analyzed for lessons about damage control, crew training, and the importance of morale. Every surface warfare officer in the U.S. Navy learns about the battle off Samar and Johnston's role in it. The destroyer that fought like a battleship remains an inspiration more than 8 decades after her loss. The legacy extends beyond the Navy. Johnston's story has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and articles. James Hornfischer's The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors brought the battle off Samar to a wider audience and became a bestseller. The story has been featured in history magazines, television documentaries, and online videos. Each retelling introduces new generations to the story of extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds. In an age when heroism can sometimes seem like an antiquated concept, Johnston's story reminds us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when the situation demands it. For the families of Johnston's crew, the ship's legacy is deeply personal. Many descendants have become active in preserving their relatives' memory, attending commemorations, contributing to historical research, and ensuring that future generations know the story. Some have visited the Philippines to see where the battle occurred. Others have connected with descendants of the survivors, forming friendships based on their shared connection to Johnston. The crew's sacrifice has meaning beyond the historical. It represents fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands who gave their lives for their country and their shipmates. The comparison to other famous last stands in military history is inevitable. Johnston's fight has been compared to the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off the Persian army, to the Alamo, where a small garrison resisted overwhelming Mexican forces, to Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn. What distinguishes Johnston's battle is that unlike those other famous last stands, this one succeeded in its objective. The escort carriers were saved, the invasion fleet was protected, and the battle was won. Johnston and her crew didn't just die gloriously, they died achieving their mission, which makes their sacrifice all the more meaningful. The question of what gives men the courage to face certain death has fascinated historians, psychologists, and military leaders throughout history. In Johnston's case, multiple factors contributed. Commander Evans' leadership and personal example showed his crew that he would ask nothing of them that he wouldn't do himself. The crew's training had prepared them technically for combat and had instilled discipline and teamwork. The Navy's traditions and culture emphasized duty, honor, and sacrifice. The crew's bonds with each other created a loyalty that transcended self-preservation. And perhaps most importantly, they understood they were fighting to protect other Americans, the men on the escort carriers, the troops on the invasion beaches. They had a mission, and they were determined to accomplish it regardless of cost. The modern U.S. Navy honors Johnston's memory in various ways. A Burke-class guided missile destroyer, USS Johnston, DDG-123, was commissioned in 2023, carrying forward the name and the legacy. The new Johnston's crest incorporates elements honoring the original ship and Commander Evans' Native American heritage. When the new ship was commissioned, survivors' descendants and historians were present to witness the Navy's commitment to preserving the memory of the original Johnston. The commissioning ceremony included specific references to the battle off Samar and to the destroyer's famous declaration that she would fight like a battleship. Educational institutions have also recognized Johnston's significance. The Naval Academy includes the battle off Samar in its curriculum, using it as a case study in leadership, tactics, and professional ethics. The Naval War College analyzes the battle for strategic and operational lessons. High schools and universities near where Johnston was built, or where crew members came from, have incorporated the ship's story into local history curricula. This educational legacy ensures that future generations will learn about Johnston and the principles her crew exemplified. The cultural impact of Johnston's story extends to popular media as well. Video games about naval warfare frequently feature Johnston, allowing players to command the destroyer in recreations of the battle off Samar. Naval fiction authors have written novels inspired by Johnston's fight. Documentary filmmakers have produced detailed examinations of the battle. The 2019 discovery of the wreck generated news coverage around the world, introducing millions of people to the story for the first time. Each new retelling spreads the story further and ensures that Johnston's memory remains alive. Conclusion. The complete story of USS Johnston is ultimately a story about the best of human nature revealed under the worst of circumstances. It's about a commander who led from the front and never asked his crew to do anything he wouldn't do. It's about sailors who performed their duties with skill and courage, even when those duties led to certain death. It's about a ship that exceeded every expectation and fought far above her weight class. And it's about sacrifice that had meaning. Johnston and her crew didn't die in vain. They died achieving their mission and saving thousands of other American lives. Commander Ernest E. Evans told his crew at commissioning that Johnston would be a fighting ship, that they would seek out the enemy and engage aggressively, and that their job was to protect the larger ships of the fleet no matter the cost. On October 25, 1944, off Samar Island, Evans and his crew proved that those weren't just words, but a commitment they were willing to die to fulfill. Johnston attacked when any rational calculation said attack was suicide. She fought when she was already mortally wounded. She disrupted the enemy's attack and bought the time necessary for the escort carriers to escape. She did exactly what her commander had promised she would do. She fought like a battleship despite being a destroyer. The men of USS Johnston came from all across America, small towns and big cities, farms and factories, different ethnic backgrounds and different faiths. What united them was their service to their country and their loyalty to each other and their ship. They were ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things because the situation demanded it, and because their training, their leadership, and their character prepared them to rise to the challenge. Their story deserves to be remembered not just because it's dramatic or inspiring, but because it represents the best of what American service members have always been: dedicated, skilled, brave, and willing to sacrifice for something larger than themselves. The discovery of Johnston's wreck in 2019 and 2021 brought closure to families who had waited 75 years to know where their loved ones rest. It allowed us to pay tribute to the ship and crew in a tangible way. And it reminded a new generation that the freedoms we enjoy were purchased at great cost by people who often receive far less recognition than they deserve. Johnston's crew didn't fight for glory or fame. Most Americans in 1944 had never heard of the battle off Samar and didn't know what Johnston had done. They fought because it was their duty, because their shipmates depended on them, and because they understood that failure would mean the deaths of thousands of other Americans. In the final accounting, USS Johnston and her crew accomplished something truly remarkable. They faced impossible odds and fought anyway. They suffered catastrophic damage and continued fighting. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and had every reason to retreat, yet they attacked. And through their courage and sacrifice, they helped win one of the most important naval battles of World War II. The destroyer that fought like a battleship earned her place in history through action, not words. Commander Evans and his crew showed us what courage looks like, what duty means, and what sacrifice accomplishes. As long as there is a United States Navy, the story of USS Johnston will be told. As long as there are people who value courage and sacrifice, Commander Evans and his crew will be remembered. And as long as their wreck rests on the ocean floor, 4 miles down in the darkness, Johnston will stand as a monument to all those who have gone down to the sea in ships and who have paid the ultimate price in service to their country. They shall not be forgotten. The destroyer that fought like a battleship and the men who made her legendary have earned their immortality.